Jim, I would like to ask you first this morning to talk to me a little bit about your role as a caregiver with Rita and what you have learned, some ups, some downs, some triumphs, and just share that with us this morning.
I think the first thing that challenged me about it was, is this going to be the worst phase of our life or the best phase of our life? And I just felt prayerfully that it should be spiritually the most enriching phase of one's life. And I think I was able to enter into that because I had always had in the trajectory of my own thinking and my own life that primarily I was not having an identity as a professional, but I had an identity as being a person. And to be personal means that you are intrinsically relational. So that if you lose a function like the loss of memory or the loss of anything else in old age, that disability is not necessarily a spiritual liability, but rather it can be an asset for something that is more spiritual, even though it's less physical. And so that's how we entered into it. And so I said, my dear, this is going to be the best phase of our life, and that this will be the most enriching period of our marriage together. So now we're 59 years married. In a few months we'll be having our 60th, and I embrace it as the best phase of life.
How inspiring, and congratulations on the anniversary coming up. The statement that you made about personhood is something that we want to explore today, and which we've started exploring. And I think exploring it as you have laid it out, as a walk in caregiving, is the way to do it. I want to ask you how you would define the term personhood, and you can define it any way you want to.
Well, I think it's a very elusive word for many of us. And as I've studied the history in the philosophy of personhood, I think we discover that every civilization has never been able quite to grasp it. Mm-hmm. That if we start with the Greeks, who used the word prosopon for the person, it was a dramatic persona. In other words, a persona was simply a mask that the player acts out in defiance of the fates and seeks for a brief moment to have a persona dramaticus. Well, a dramatic act is very fragile for personhood. And so the Romans, they developed something rather different. They, from their legal and practical mindset, said, well, a person is a legal category for a man who is a free citizen of the Roman Empire. That's a person. So women and children are non-persons in that category. Mm-hmm. And then later, the Stoics, and under the influence of the Stoics, an early Christian philosopher called Boethius defined the person as an individual substance of a rational nature. Well, to be a substance and to be rational is very reductionistic, really, of the quality of relationships that we have in a person. But it was that definition that has really stuck with the Western mindset until modern times. And so, of course, wherever there's been the practice of Roman law, there has also been male chauvinism. And it's understandable that it's a legal basis for chauvinism that the Western world has always suffered from. You see? Mm-hmm. So the idea of restricting it to one sex, and then in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, to define, as René Descartes was to define, that a person is simply a rational thinking being, that I think, therefore I am, has been the mindset that we've been brought up with. So I think what disability now in old age is doing is saying, But does it mean that people who lose their memory, their mind, are non-persons? Well, for Descartes, that was the definition. So I think what modern medical ethicists are beginning to recognize is that if we want to treat people with deference and reverence and respect, despite their disability, then these 18th century notions, 17th and 18th century notions of what is a person have to be redefined.
Yes.
And so today, I think that we, and I can explore this further if you want to, we need to reconsider what is the nature of a person.
Please do. Please explore that for us.
Well, I think the way we can explore it is to say that at least the Romans had it right when they said there are two words for having a personal identity. One word is ipsi, which means myself. And the other word is idem, which means that I'm the same of. So the tension of being personal is that there's an intrinsic uniqueness to each one of us that is the ipsi. I am myself and no other. So don't compare me with anybody else. I am who I am. That's ipsi. And people who have the strongest self-identity are significantly the people who can relate most to the other. So I can afford to be the same as you are if I'm at the same time recognized with my own uniqueness. And so this identification of ipsi and idem and bringing them together gives us much more significance for this. And so one of the things that was done by Pope John II in his doctorate thesis work when he was still a student in Poland was to develop this whole concept of the incommunicability of being myself. Don't compare me with anybody else. But at the same time, the mystery of being personal is that you're intrinsically relational. And you know, Danny, yourself, you as a neuroscientist are so upfront with this whole revolution that's taking place in the last decade of what we might call interpersonal biology. This recognition that the brain that we have is so intrinsically one of relationalities. All our emotions are expressive of how we're relating with the other.
That's absolutely true. And it's certainly been shown that individuals who are elderly, even nonagenarians and older, if they are not in an environment that is enriching,
Yes.
socially enriching, in which they can create, express, and be relational, they're deprived.
Yes.
And there are neurobiological changes that occur that are detrimental.
Exactly.
That's exactly
So what
right.
I think is that the way we treat old people is like the canary in the mine. The way we treat them negatively is what's the toxicity of our own culture. And that what the toxicity that we see in the boomer generation that we're now coming to the close of is that perhaps since the war there has never been more an intensification of having a professional identity. So we ask the stranger not who are you, but what do you do?
Yes.
And so your function is what determines who you are. And while it's true that we need the ethics of professional standards in life, we've taken professionalism far too far in assuming that because you're a neuroscientist or because you're a professor or you're a philosopher or you're a scientist or indeed a housewife, that that's my identity.
Right.
And so I think the consequence of that reductionism of personhood in the eclipsing of personhood by professionalism has brought us to the situation where the worst doom and gloom we can imagine for the human being is to lose your mind, because your mind matters most of all. And what we're arguing is, no, the mind is important, but it's not who you are as a person. There's something much more to being a person.
Yes.
And so exploring what that more is really our journey, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I think the time is right for a paradigm shift, if there ever has been a time, because you mentioned the baby boom generation. There are 10 million of those individuals that will probably be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And so
Yes.
it's going to be very hard for that generation who has had this occupational identity to now shift into a more relational one.
Exactly. But I think our young people are already beginning to show it. And I have 9 grandchildren. We have 9 grandchildren, my wife and myself,
Yes.
and 4 great-grandchildren. But what we see with our grandchildren is that we ask them, what profession are you going to go into? And they look at you with glazed eyes as if to say, we're bored by professions. So what is it you want to do then? Well, I have 2 or 3 close buddies, and they're very creative, and I respect and esteem their abilities, and so we're going to set up and do something together. Well, it's dangerous to think that the next generation, with all the complexity of modern technical life, are going to be able to stand on their own. But that's the reaction, I think, that's taking place. That people want to say friendship should be at the heart of our business enterprise. And my own son, who's a management consultant, is actually writing a book that he is revising as the Personal Corporation.
Very interesting.
How can one engender personhood within the corporate life of making money?
This needs to happen in many different fields. Certainly in the
Yes.
medical field, it
That's
needs to
right,
happen as well.
yes. So I think you're right that our governments and our social services are going to go bankrupt if we think that we can go on paying for professional help for old people. I think that our social services will be in crisis, and Medicare will be in crisis, unless we have a shift to what we might call a culture of compassion.
How do we, you, me, lay people, begin to bring about this change and be most effective to have our voices heard? How do we do that?
Well, I was asked in a different context, Danny, in a church, when does one begin to become an elder, as distinct from being a senior? Because I was making the distinction that a senior is simply somebody who's incapacitated by age from now being in a job. So they are in a form of apartheid that we call the retired.
Mm-hmm.
And they're called seniors because they've retired. And the indictment against seniors is people who will stir out their lives with coffee spoons at Starbucks in the morning, and their only monument, lost golf balls on the course in the afternoon. That's a senior.
Right.
Someone who seems to be on the shelf. An elder is someone who has relational skills that become increasingly more valued and important the older they grow. So they're never on the shelf, because in the community, in the society, they are those vital members who are contributing to social and relational life. They are persons. And so when do you become an elder? I think you become an elder as a child. In other words, you just met one of our daughters this morning, Penny. Mm-hmm. Well, when Penny was 3 or 4 years old, she had a cousin, just a year older, that had Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. And so the 2 little girls played together until our Penny began to realize that there was something different from Sheila. And that difference was that she had Down syndrome. But the consequence was that then the empathetic skills that Penny has always had began to grow, because she was challenged to protect and have compassion and kindness on her disabled cousin. And so all her life, she has worked quite naturally with the mentally handicapped. It's been natural for her because she grew up that way. And so we need a generation of young people who enjoy the privilege of being with a handicapped, because their own relational skills are going to grow as a result.
That's a beautiful story. And, you know, the phenomenon of children giving care
Yes.
to their elders is a growing one.
Yes.
And in many homes, we know that there are 2, 3, 4 generations sometimes caring for
That's right.
an elder with
Yes.
dementia of some kind.
Well, you may know the book by Margaret Atkinson, I think her name is, called The Roots of Empathy.
Yes.
And it's the story of an educationalist who said, how can we treat empathy in the classroom? How can we train our children to be empathetic? And so she got a blanket and a volunteer mother and her newborn babe to sit in the classroom one Friday every month. And through the process of the 8 or 9 grades of schooling, these children had that same child always once a month in their midst.
That's precious.
And now it's become official policy, I think, for some of our educational provincial governments to do this.
Right. I have a question for you now regarding how this attitude that you have adopted, it's really you, it's not an attitude, of valuing the person despite disability, has colored your caregiving experience. Tell us specific ways that you are able to interact with Rita and bring out her innate self and validate her where she is now. How do you do those things in your daily life with her?
Well, it's all part of one's rootedness in early life. And so I had the privilege at Oxford of being a tutor, which meant that you had a one-to-one relationship with your pupils. So your pupils became friends, and that you were mentoring them personally on a weekly basis. And so after they graduated, they would keep in touch with me and once a year perhaps write to me. Well, that continuum of being primarily a person before I was a professional is something that I've now brought into our marriage and into our late family life. Because Rita is not just simply a housewife. She's my wife, uniquely so. And because she's my wife, we have a personal relationship with each other that has always been special. And we're devoted to each other. And so I told her that with her disability, this would be an opportunity for more expression of love rather than less. And so it has been. And so when she began to lose her memory, we talked about this quite openly. It's a great loss, my dear. It's like losing a foot or losing an arm. And it's unfortunate it's neither, but it's your mind that is being lost. But in spite of that, let me be memory to you. So can we share a memory? And then our grandchildren began to help, because one of our grandchildren has produced a series of pictures of all the family and the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren with their names, their photograph, and their date of their birth, of their birthdays. And so whenever Rita says, oh, who is Jonathan? I've forgotten who Jonathan is. Well, my dear, here's the album. And so there's a memory book of love that helps her to recapture what she's lost, and to know that others are remembering even though she has lost it herself. And of course, because of our Christian faith, to know that the resurrection is the reality that God remembers us. The dying thief on the cross, Jesus, he asked Jesus, he said, will you remember me when you come into your kingdom? And so that's the affirmation that when we're dust, we're still eternally remembered. And so that is projected back into our present situation. That many times, my dear, I will have to act as your memory. But that's okay, because we can share that together. Now, in terms then of other elements of caring, there are things that we still have a sense of shame. Perhaps shame is a deep ingredient of our personhood and the dignity of being persons, that we have a sense of shame. So to protect the other person and not remind them of things that are negative is also part of the skill of caretaking. That we don't remember bad things. We're the monitor of good things, loving things that we can share together.
That is absolutely on target from everything that I've heard and read and discussed with other individuals about person-centered care and the way one should interact with those with dementia.
Yes.
In a very validating way. Another question. We are very interested in the ability and need for individuals with cognitive disabilities to express themselves. Because one of the things that we know that happens in dementia is that an isolation takes place because of this lack of ability to communicate. How do you see creativity as important for our sense of self-preservation and for the preserving of our personhood?
Yes. Well, I think, and you obviously know much more about this, Danny, than I do as a neuroscientist, but it does seem that in our basal memory, there are elements from childhood that need to be sometimes elicited in old age. And one of the things that Rita always grew up with was that her mother was the soul of hospitality. And during the war, many young officers were brought for a Sunday lunch or for the weekend rest from their military duties. And so she grew up to imitate her mother with hospitality. And so today, what is most significant for Rita is always to keep asking me each day, and who are we going to invite for a meal? Who's going to come next? Well, we're limited in how much we can do ourselves, so we are now booking a place to have dinner every week with some couple that we share together. And it's on these occasions of hospitality where Rita really lights up and expresses herself. Now, her mother was also an artist, amateur artist, and so I thought, well, perhaps this is a hidden skill that she's never yet recovered, that needs to be activated. So I have employed a Chinese artist to come and help her. And of course, the problem, I think, with doing things innovatively is that you have to do them gradually. And so when our artist friend arrived with her easel and paints and wanted Rita to plunge straight in, this was a failure. It didn't work. It has to be thought about, talked about, and practiced in small ways first. So we're still waiting for the moment when she'll be able to start using an easel, but she hasn't started yet. But at least we've started with hospitality. And it's not a start, it's a continuance. So I think that if one can see that there are things that will remain rooted in that person's life, even though other memories have gone, activate those first. So that's what we're doing with hospitality. But it's the equivalent to what you've been exploring with in art therapy.
You had just spoken at a dementia conference that we were having at the University of Alabama. And we met you later that evening and heard you speak in a church in our town. I brought my mother, who had just had the same walk with my dad as his caregiver. And I told you that she was having a hard time, and you said, let me sit with her. And you did. You sat with her and talked to her about godly suffering. And you shared with her about that. Would you speak to me for a second about godly suffering?
Yes, I think that the Apostle Paul, in his second epistle to the Corinthians, speaks about suffering that is incredible. In chapter 4, he's in a near-death experience, or chapter 1, and then chapter 4, he speaks of that near-death experience. He then catalogues at the end of his epistle all the different sufferings that he's had of flogging and stoning and imprisonment and shipwreck, all sorts of things unimaginable. And it's been estimated by scholars that 10 strong men could scarcely have borne and survived what he went through. But in the middle of all of this, he says in chapter 7, verse 10, that the pain that is born of God, that is to say, brought into God's presence, where God becomes relevant to the suffering because of the suffering of his own Son on the cross, that pain that is born into his presence has a salutary, creative effect that enriches us for the rest of our life. But then it goes on to say, but the pain that is of man, that in self-reliance, in a stoic fashion of repressing all your own emotions, you carry yourself. He says the pain that is of man, the stoic pain, brings death. It destroys us. And so the wonderful thing that a Christian has in faith is that he knows that he's never carrying the pain or the caregiving on his own or her own. It's always in the light of the cross. It's always in the light of a suffering Savior. And so it's that reality that we ourselves discovered, because before we ever came here to Vancouver in 1968, we had a Mongol son, a Down syndrome little boy. And mercifully, at one level, it did die under an operation. And so the little child didn't survive. But that's when we learnt the significance of that verse. Bringing all this grief into the presence of God relieves us and enriches us for the rest of our life. So that you can say to a person of rich character, tell me the secret of how you suffered redemptively. But the other, the bitterness, the resentfulness, the anger, the loneliness with which one bears one's burden is destructive. And so that principle goes into caregiving. And we can always see those who receive all this and can radically deal with it. Just a few weeks ago, I have been in communication with a woman whose husband committed suicide in a bath. And as he cried out, stabbing himself, she rushed in. And when the police arrived, they arrested her, thinking that she was involved in manslaughter. It was crazy. And the pathologist, of course, had to deal with it. But how can I relate to that poor woman now? Because it's in the depth that you can communicate. Because Christ has been in the depth himself. And so, in that great psalm, Psalm 130, 130 it is, De Profundis we call it, out of the depth. The psalmist is crying out of the depth of his agony. But then that was the same psalm that was used by our Lord in his crying out of the depth. And so that's what I think, to give you a long response to. It's because you can see how passionately important it is for me. That is what has been our experience. Bring God into your suffering, and suffering is not the negative thing that others might think it is. Well, you know, one thing we haven't talked about in relation to personhood and care that goes with it is presence. So when some people come into the room, they're a presence to the rest, and others seem to have no presence. So what is it that at a subliminal level will activate response or arousal of attention with somebody with dementia? And I think it's this other quality that we can call presence.
And how would you define that? What is it made up of, and what does it look like?
Well, presence is a mystery. You might call it a relational mystery. That their deportment, their consistency, their integrity, their character, all of these things fill the atmosphere with a radiance that you can understand why in the Middle Ages they had a halo over the saints. The halo was a sort of artistic representation of presence.
Do you consider this a lavishing out of the soul? Do you consider this a fleshly bearing of the spirit?
Yes, I think it's expressive of what is soulful in that person, yes. And it's not buried, it's not cut off. It's so real, it radiates from them.
My question is then, does the same thing happen to an Alzheimer's patient or a dementia patient? Do they still have that presence even toward the end?
That I don't know, because I haven't had experience of people at that age. But my sense is that if we're all made in the image and likeness of God in the Imago Dei, which we haven't touched upon, then there's a sense in which we have a God-given reality to our lives that is more than animal. We're not animals, we're human beings. And with human beings, there is this dignity of the uniqueness of the self that we've already expressed. But also there's a mystery that cannot be dissected. An anatomy class will never define what presence is. A literary class perhaps will talk about it, you see. It is an artistic quality. There's a beauty.
And I think that you have just said one of the most important things, and that is it's artistic, and we have to approach it in a different way.
Yes.
And in order to analyze it, we have to have a melding together of the science and the art.
Yes.
To be able to get at what that means.
So I think our culture needs to redefine three dimensions of reality. One we may call the dimension of art. The other is the dimension of science. And the other is the dimension of religion. And the dimension of art is the particularity with which we appreciate in an art gallery one particular portrait, one particular painting. I like that. Or a vase that stands by itself, because the aesthetic is narrowing the multitude into the particular. Whereas science is reversing the order of flow from the whole series of particulars that we observe and measure to general principles of scientific laws. So we go from the particular to the general. I think the religious dimension is the dimension of the personal, where we combine the particular with the general. In other words, ipsi and idem are synthesized into a quality that we can only call relational. I'm able to relate to you because we are of the same, but I relate to you because I'm different from you. So we have a dialectic of similarity and difference when we have a conversation.
Don't you think then that this is one way that would enable us to treat someone with dignity that has a disability?
Absolutely.
Because we see them in that light.
Absolutely. We see their ipsi.
Right. You talked about the importance of childhood memories and bringing those back out. One of the things that we are finding as we administer various arts therapies to individuals with dementia is that those childhood memories do find a way to come out through creativity, through music, art, dance, storytelling, and that sort of thing, and reminiscence. Mm-hmm. Tell us, Jim, how caregivers can take hope and encouragement from the ideas that you've discussed with us today about personhood, and so that they can be buoyed up in their journey with their loved one.
I think one of the great temptations for the caregiver is to do it from patronage, that they're superior and their situation comparably is therefore different from that with the one they're caring. And so when they lose the sense of reciprocity, they then have what you might call emotional burnout, because they're doing all the giving. But in all relationships, there's reciprocity, that you're kind to me and I'm kind to you, that I care for you and you can care for me. Now, a caregiver has the impression that they're doing it all in a one-way street. Well, I think the consequence of that will be exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. Also, of course, I think what we discover with caregiving is that it touches emotions that we've never been skilled in using. So some of us grow up to be impatient and we're always angry. Well, that's hopeless for a caregiver. And so one of the things that we discover about caregiving is it's a test of our own narrative at the end of our own life. How have we lived is how we will then respond as a caretaker. And so if I always live selfishly, I'll be stretched, screaming mad, because I have myself to care for, not you. We cry out, you see. And so again, if somebody has always been rather selfish and not generous, then again they're tested. So caregiving is a mark for sanctity at the end of life, for sainthood, not for the immature. And so if we remain ourselves immature, and tragically many of our old people's homes are filled with people who are immature, because the exaggeration of old age is that the vices and the weaknesses that we had when we were younger now become amplified and exaggerated in old age. And so old age is a judgment. It's a judgment for those who need to be cared for, but it's a judgment of those who are caring. And so it works both ways. And so it's essential, I think, for us to recognize, as I said, that you become an elder when you start as a child having empathy, and not simply remain a senior that is now on the shelf. And so I think, as I embrace this period of my life, this is not just a test of one's previous training, it's a fruition of what one was meant to be. And so I see that becoming older is for the mark of maturity, of fruitfulness, and not of decadence, not of deterioration. And of course, we're meant to be spiritual beings, not just material beings. So if we've lived a sensual life and have no real quality of being spiritual towards other people, then clearly that will mark us in our old age. So I thank Rita, I thank others that I'm in touch with who are old and having to care for, that they're bringing things out of me that are potentials for my own growth. And so it's not a burden, it's a privilege.